Hi, I'm Dr. Connie. Keila and I are going to discuss shadow and politics today. Some of you may have noticed that there's a lot of shadow around these days. And if you think about this more psychologically, you may recognize it as shadow projection. What's happening in the political sphere and screaming from the headlines at us is the weaponization of shadow projection. We're going to talk about that together, but first, I wanted to introduce you to the new edition of Meeting the Shadow, because if you're interested in reading about this, this is a collection of 65 different thought leaders about the shadow. And there's a whole section on politics and enemy making. The enemy maker within us. Why do we need enemies? Why do we use shadow projection to create us and them? My group and the other group, heroes and villains, believers and infidels. There's a section on chauvinism and misogyny. There's a section on race and on the US-Soviet relationship, which is changing minute by minute as we speak. There's a section on the Nazis and how that could have possibly happened in Germany in World War II. There's a section on psychopaths and criminals and road rage. And so this book, which is now just available with a brand new epilogue that I wrote to update shadow work in politics, is now available wherever you buy books online. And I wanted to let you know that. So now I'm going to join Keila for a live stream on this topic and hope that we hear from you in the chat on our Substack platform. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Shadow Work to Expand Awareness. I'm here with Dr. Connie, and today we're going to explore the shadow in politics. Welcome, Connie.
Hi, Keila.
So I have a series of questions that we will be exploring with Dr. Connie around this topic of the shadow and how it is portrayed in our politics, in our society. The first question is, what do persecution, war, and genocide have in common?
You and I have spoken in other live stream conversations about shadow projection, and especially in relationships and in families, that the source of a lot of conflict is when we unconsciously attribute something that's denied in ourselves, that's unacceptable or ugly or shameful in us. We attribute it to someone else. So maybe we're attracted to someone because he or she carries a trait that we don't like in ourselves, let's say aggression or ambition. And so what happens is we rid our own psyches of that trait so we don't have to feel it. You don't have to be uncomfortable. And we let the other person carry it for us. So that's individual shadow projection. And this also happens with projecting the light. Let's say we have a spiritual teacher or a religious clergy person, and we project onto them holiness or perfection or enlightenment. And they carry that for us, and we disown it in ourselves. It really happens in every arena. So today we want to expand on that from individual shadow projection to collective or group or national shadow projection. Wars, persecution, and genocide, all of this cruelty that humanity has perpetrated on itself, is all rooted in shadow projection. And once you see that as the root cause of all this cruelty, it's kind of shocking when you look at history, how much this mechanism of one group making an enemy of another group has colored human history and created so much suffering. So why do we need to make enemies? I mean, it seems somehow like human beings need to have an enemy. What purpose does the enemy of America, or the enemy of Christianity, or the enemy of white people, what purpose does that really serve? It serves the purpose of creating an us and a them, my tribe and the other guys, the white hats and the black hats, how whatever kind of labels we give to the us and them that we create through shadow projection. And that other group carries for us those unacceptable qualities that we can't see in ourselves, that we can't possibly acknowledge, or accept in ourselves. And it's not always clear what those qualities are. But if you begin to look at our collective issues like racism and the statements that are often made by people about who are in different races, the stereotypes, sexism, the statements that are made about women, immigrants, we call it xenophobia, all the statements now that are being made about immigrants as a group, as a stereotype, Muslims, Native Americans, gay and trans people, all of that is rooted in an incapacity to really encounter and integrate our own shadow material and the need as groups to put it out there and make the other group carry it, make the other group a scapegoat, really, so that they're so dehumanized that they can then be killed. And we've seen this throughout history. We've asked ourselves, how could this happen? Genocide after genocide. This is how it happens, through dehumanizing the other with shadow projection.
Mm-hmm. And that creates the polarization, encouraging that division and, like you mentioned before, tribal thinking.
Yes.
Yeah.
My tribe is good and that tribe is bad.
Mm-hmm.
And we see this in our political arena now, not just Democrats and Republicans or Christians and non-Christians or woke people and conservative people or, whatever we call it. Liberal became a bad word or conservative becomes a bad word. People get entrenched in their tribes and then they're only sharing groupthink and it becomes like a cult. They're not even exposed to other beliefs and ideas.
How can we encourage people to step outside of their current thinking and bring more humanized perspectives, more considerate perspectives to their thinking? What are some ways we can encourage compassion with each other?
Well, I think people who are listening to us have some psychological insight that they have a shadow. They have an unconscious that erupts in whatever way it is, whether it's in a bad habit or whether it's a self-destructive behavior or whether it's a repeating pattern, whatever it is. So this is another way that the shadow erupts. And if you're interested in shadow work, you can begin to frame it now more collectively in terms of your social and political attitudes, what you call the social shadow, what Jung called the collective shadow, and begin to reflect on what is it that you're saying to yourself about other people, about other groups. What is the bias that's hidden in what you're telling yourself about, quote, them, people in the other tribe? And begin to notice how you've internalized unconscious bias. It could be ageism, it could be sexism, it could be racism. Begin to self-reflect on these isms. So that's the first step. Awareness, shadow work awareness is the first step. And then what are the consequences for you of doing that? Who do you feel separate from? Do you feel hatred? Do you feel judgment? That's a really good question. Ask yourself, who are you judging? And why? Where does that come from? Was there a message in your family that carried that judgment through generations about a particular group or a particular kind of person? Now, elite is a bad word. Or we could say evangelical could be a bad word. What are your own unconscious biases and how are they sort of inculcated in your family system? In your religious community, did you learn from your religion that other groups are bad? Did you carry out that shadow projection yourself in the way that you behave? And once you start to see that, it can be rather shocking because you recognize how you've narrowed your reality. And you know what? You've closed your heart. And what would it be like to open your heart just before 9/11 and then after 9/11, when there was so much hatred of Muslims? I was writing a book about a Sufi poet, and Sufism is part of Islam. It's mystical Islam. And I became entrenched in studying mystical Islam. And it was very confusing because the collective culture in America was so every Muslim is a terrorist, right? And I was just falling in love with this poet and this mystic. Now, he wasn't from today. He wasn't, connected to 9/11, granted, and all that. He was an individual. And maybe that's one thing to talk about is everybody's an individual. So when we operate by groupthink, our group and their group, we're not considering individuals and how they were shaped and how they were traumatized and how they suffer and what influenced them. So I think that awareness is the first step, and it takes a lot of self-reflection. And that's a good beginning for our listeners.
Yeah, the group think is what allows people to dehumanize because the entity becomes that entire belief system.
Yes, and look at in America, if we look at American history, the genocide of Native Americans, which no one talks about. I didn't learn about that in school. I think there was some education about it for later generations, but I didn't learn about that in school. Nobody really processed the guilt and the shame of what happened in the early history of this country. And then slavery and all of the people who were brought from Africa on the slave ships and treated so cruelly. Why? Because of what you just said. They were dehumanized. White people believed they were not human. And so they were allowed to treat people that way. And look at what happened with family separation under the first Trump administration, separating mothers and kids from each other. Why? Because they were dehumanized. Nobody believed they would feel what we might feel if that happened to us. So this process is very alive today. It's not only in our history. I mean, right now they're building kind of concentration camps at Guantanamo for illegal immigrants. So this is very current. And it's important, I think, for each of us to look at, are we contributing to the darkness or to the light? Are we clarifying our own awareness and really owning our own shadow material, our own judgments, our own hatreds, our own biases, our own anger? Or are we contributing to the darkness?
Yeah. I'm going to ask these questions in our broadcast channel.
Yeah.
The ritual role played by the enemy.
Well, in a way, every war is a holy war. I mean, if we look at Israel and Palestine, throughout history, they have seen each other as enemies from the beginning of the Bible. And so their war, which is so horrific today in our lifetimes, it's a holy war in the sense that it's about who is God, who has the right to land, who has the right to their beliefs, their freedom, who has the right to thrive, who has the right to be educated. The term holy war, you look at the Christian Crusades. The Christian Crusades killed thousands of people in the name of God. When people kill others in the name of God, it's clearly a holy war. But when they don't use theological language, there's usually something behind the scenes that's like that anyway. We look at Russia and Ukraine. Putin thinks he owns Ukraine. He has every right to that land and its people. It's a holy war for him. It's life or death. Nothing else matters but victory for him. So I think we start to see that there's this kind of a metaphysic behind every war. World War II against Hitler. There's a kind of good and evil dynamic across the whole world.
It's always like a moral duty that is sensed by the collective.
That's right. And by the combatants. And they use that moral duty as the excuse to kill.
Yeah. How do you think that the current US government is weaponizing shadow projection?
This begins to get a little politically biased from my point of view, and I just want to be upfront about that. I think that most politicians use shadow projection without knowing it because they're unconscious of their own us and them thinking. So there are people in every party and every persuasion using shadow projection. But what we haven't seen since the days of Hollywood blacklisting is a candidate and now a president who has really weaponized this, who has really tuned in to people's fear and hatred and made it his campaign. Trump's campaign was about getting rid of certain people, dehumanizing them, and then getting rid of them. It was about dismantling the government, the parts of the government that help certain people, because he doesn't think that whether it's the Department of Education or Medicare or grants for research or any of that, he doesn't think that the people deserve that. They should get that from the states, not from the federal government. He's weaponized shadow projection to such an extent that it's become so obvious to me that that's how he created his base from the very first campaign. He kept just adding fuel to that fire, you know, the replacement theory of men who feel they're being replaced by more educated people or people of other races. It's all about shadow projection. Making America great again is about going back to the past, to a time when white people had privilege and wealthy people had privilege, and other people who carry his shadow projection don't deserve it, don't deserve their rights, voting rights, habitable planet, education, healthcare. It's very clever what he's done. It's extremely clever. And he's been able to use shadow projection to arouse millions of people's hatred, and some of it conscious and some of it unconscious.
How can we do collective shadow work? How can we all partake in this grand healing?
I've often kind of wished that our culture could do some collective ritual, that we could grieve for the people we've lost in wars like Vietnam and Iraq, that we could kind of acknowledge the guilt, acknowledge the responsibility that we have for causing harm, the torture that was done in Iraq, the internment of Japanese during that war. From my point of view, a collective ritual would make sacred some of this shadow material, but that's not going to happen with our government. And so it needs to happen from the bottom up. It's not going to happen top down, but it could happen in groups of people who want to gather and do this together, whether a church community or a friendship community or a school, even a family. That for me is one way through kind of a rite of passage for America to face the shadow. I mean, it's tricky right now. The denial of the climate crisis to me is like the most pressing issue. And that's not really about shadow projection, right? It's about denial. It's about denial and empowering the corporations and the wealthy people so that they can maintain their power. But that's a little bit different mechanism. It's kind of tricky to talk about that, although for me, from my point of view, denial is part of the shadow, but it's not shadow projection. That's been going on by all of the youth movements who are trying to bring the issue out of the shadow, out of the collective shadow. And they, in some ways, I think, contributed to all the climate legislation that Biden was able to pass. Who knows what's going to happen with that now? I think there's also opportunity here for activists, for social justice activists, to do activism differently, not from anger and hatred, because if we really are self-reflective and doing our own shadow work, then we're not going to be projecting all of that negativity onto the people who are causing harm. We know, for example, the fossil fuel companies and the banks are causing terrible harm. But how do we do activism with shadow awareness? It's very different. And when I was at Berkeley in the late 60s doing activism, and it was nothing but rage. So it's very different, I would say, to do activism from grief. And in some ways, I think there are groups, social justice groups, that are learning that now, partly because they're losing a lot of cases, a lot of efforts, a lot of our wishes and ideals and dreams. And so we have to come from a different place now. If you are listening to this and you want to work on climate, or on racism, or on gun violence, or on hunger, whatever your passion, I suggest that you do it with shadow awareness. See what it's like to be an activist without projection. Is it even possible? Is it possible to look at a policeman who's standing in front of you and keeping you from walking in protest, to actually feel equality with that policeman, to feel open-hearted, to understand where he's coming from, fulfilling his role? It's very different than the old kind of activism from shadow projection.
Takes a lot more patience and holding back those reactions, those like emotional triggers with the prejudice that comes with prejudice.
Right.
Well, thank you for all of your insights in this conversation. I
Thank
learned
you, Keila.
and tell this is something you're very passionate about. And I appreciate you coming forward and shedding light to all of these things because we need this awareness right now.
We do. We do. We don't know what's next. There's a lot of uncertainty as the government is being dismantled. We don't know if democracy is going to hold. We don't know what's coming. Our suggestions are really to be self-reflective and see if you can add to the light and not to the darkness right now. We don't need more people adding to the collective darkness.